When most of the town saw him building a barn around a Quonset hut, they couldn't stop laughing. Little did they know he was about to create something that would change the way they thought about insulation forever. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe that sometimes the most unconventional ideas are the ones that make the biggest difference, hit that subscribe button because you won't want to miss what happens next. The town was small, nestled in the heart of a valley surrounded by towering peaks. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and change didn't come easily. People lived by old traditions, relying on age-old methods to keep warm during the long, harsh winters. The cold in this part of the world could cut right through you, chilling to the bone, no matter how many layers you wore. It was survival, plain and simple. But there was one man in town who didn't accept survival as an inevitable consequence of the cold. He saw it as a challenge. His name was Thomas Granger, a quiet man kept mostly to himself and often the subject of quiet gossip. The townfolk said he had a strange way of doing things. They had all witnessed his unconventional ways before, odd contraptions, strange repairs, and ideas that seemed to come from somewhere beyond their understanding. For most, living in a Quonset hut was more than enough. It was built for efficiency, but efficiency wasn't enough for Thomas. He lived in one, sure, but it never felt right. The roof sagged slightly in the winter. The cold crept in through the cracks no matter how hard he tried to patch them, and every winter the same uncomfortable chill gripped his bones. He couldn't quite accept it. One winter evening, sitting by the fire after a long day of chopping wood, he saw the familiar sight of snow falling gently outside. It had already been a week since the first frost, and the town had settled into its winter rhythm. Yet, for some reason, the cold gnawed at Thomas even more than usual. Something about the Quonset hut, built from thin steel and insulated with only a few layers of old materials, just wasn't cutting it anymore. It was then, as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, that the idea hit him. He had seen barns built all around the area, sturdy structures that stood against the fierce winds of winter. Why not build a barn around his Quonset hut? The Quonset was just a shell, a skeleton. If he could build something around it, something that could trap air and add extra insulation, maybe, just maybe, he could create a barrier against the harshness of the cold. It wasn't a crazy idea, or at least not to Thomas. He started sketching out his plans immediately. The shape was simple, a barn frame with space around the Quonset hut to trap the cold air. He would need to choose his materials carefully. Wood would be his foundation, something durable but light. The outer structure needed to be strong, something that could protect the Quonset from the worst of the snow and wind. The idea was born in the quiet hum of winter, an unassuming plan, but one that would have profound effects not just on his own life, but on the entire town. The following day, Thomas began gathering his materials. He bought old timber from a nearby sawmill, and on the side, he scrounged together any other materials he thought might help. The barn would need to be tall, wide enough to surround the hut, but with enough space for air to circulate around it. He wanted to create a perfect air pocket, one that would allow the space to stay warmer even in the coldest of temperatures. As he worked, the town took notice. At first, it was just a few curious stares, but before long, the comments started flying. "What's he doing now?" one neighbor muttered, shaking his head as he passed by. "Building a barn around a Quonset hut? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." The laughter began in earnest. By the end of the week, most of the town had heard about Thomas's latest project, and their reactions were far from supportive. A few friends tried to caution him. "Thomas, you know better than to waste your time with these ideas," one of the old farmers said as he watched Thomas work. "There's no need for something that big around a Quonset. It'll never work. You'll be spending the whole winter fixing things." But Thomas wasn't discouraged. He kept his head down and kept building. To him, the question wasn't whether it was a good idea. It was whether it was a solution. He had worked with his hands all his life, and he understood the value of a well-built structure. This barn was just another project, one that would require time, effort, and maybe some trial and error, but he had faith it would work. Despite the mockery, Thomas continued his work, pouring his energy into every beam and every nail. The walls of the barn took shape slowly, the timber frame rising taller with each passing day. His neighbors, however, grew bolder in their ridicule. One day, as he was up on a ladder securing the roof, a small group of them gathered across the field, laughing and pointing at the structure. "That thing looks like a joke," one said, snickering. "He's going to freeze himself out there with all that extra work." But Thomas didn't mind. He could hear them, of course. But he had something they didn't, the quiet certainty that he was doing what needed to be done. His hands worked steadily, hammering the timbers into place, creating the frame that would soon encase the Quonset hut and change everything. It wasn't just about warmth anymore. It was about proving that sometimes the most unconventional ideas were the ones that changed everything. The barn took shape slowly, piece by piece. The first part was simple, setting up the frame. Thomas worked tirelessly every day, lifting heavy beams and securing them into place. His hands were rough and calloused from years of manual labor, but there was something satisfying about the rhythm of his work. Each nail hammered in felt like a small victory, a step closer to his vision. He started with the foundation, ensuring that the barn was level and stable. He dug small trenches and placed rocks in them to give the structure a solid base. As he placed each log and beam, Thomas could already see it in his mind, the completed barn with its thick walls surrounding the Quonset hut, blocking out the cold, trapping the warmth inside. But even though he could picture it, the real challenge had just begun. The barn wasn't going to be a traditional barn. Most barns in the area had thick wooden walls, strong enough to endure harsh winters. But for Thomas, that wasn't enough. He wanted the structure to create a natural insulation barrier, trapping air in the space between the barn and the Quonset hut. The air pocket wasn't just a gap. It was the key to his plan. He had thought long and hard about how to create a structure that would give him the results he wanted. He didn't have the luxury of modern materials or technology, but he knew enough about the land and the elements to make the idea work. The barn would need to have a solid foundation, but it also needed enough space to allow the air to circulate freely between the outer walls and the hut. With the framework coming together, Thomas turned his attention to the exterior. He decided to use a combination of wood and metal for the outer walls. The wood would provide the necessary strength, while the metal would help seal the barn and create a barrier against the wind. It wasn't the most conventional choice, but Thomas had learned that innovation often meant finding new uses for old materials. As he worked, he thought about how people in the town would react once they saw the barn completed. He knew they would continue to mock him. They didn't understand, and it would take time for them to see the value in his work. But in the silence of his labor, he knew this barn was more than just a shelter. It was a symbol of his persistence, his belief that if he could make this work, he could make a difference. With every piece of metal and wood he nailed into place, Thomas felt more certain that this was the right course. It was only a matter of time before the barn was finished, and when it was, he would see if his idea was worth all the effort. For now, the work was the only thing that mattered. As the barn continued to take shape, the neighbors grew bolder in their critiques. Thomas could hear their murmurs, their pointed glances, and the occasional burst of laughter carried on the wind. At first it had been small comments, whispers behind his back when he passed by. But as the barn began to rise, so did the volume of their doubts. "What's he doing now?" Sam Tilden, the local blacksmith, scoffed one afternoon as he passed by, pausing to look at the frame. "Building a barn around a Quonset? That's a mighty big waste of time." Thomas kept working, pretending he hadn't heard the comment, but he could feel the weight of the judgment on his shoulders. It wasn't just Sam. The whole town had begun to talk. They called him a fool, a dreamer with no real understanding of the way things worked in the real world. They didn't get it, and maybe, in a way, Thomas didn't expect them to. The wind picked up, biting through his clothes as he worked, and he paused for a moment to look around. The barn was coming together, but it wasn't yet the finished product he envisioned. It was just an unfinished structure in the middle of a snowy field, with beams sticking out awkwardly, waiting for the rest to fall into place. To his neighbors, it looked like nothing more than a haphazard construction project. One morning, as Thomas stood on a ladder securing a beam, he overheard a conversation between two women standing at the edge of the property. "I saw him hauling logs again this morning," one woman said. "He's building a barn around that Quonset hut. I think he's lost his mind. It'll never work." Her friend laughed. "Of course it won't. But you know, it's Thomas. Always got some crazy idea. He'll never finish it." Thomas frowned but didn't let the words affect him. This was nothing new. He had always been the one who thought differently, who tried things others wouldn't dare. He had learned long ago that people would always doubt what they didn't understand. This was just another step in the process, another obstacle to overcome. Later that day, as he hammered in another board, the town sheriff, Hank Richards, stopped by for a chat. Hank was a regular at the local tavern, and everyone knew him for his no-nonsense attitude. He had been watching Thomas from a distance and was finally ready to offer his opinion. "You know," Hank started, tipping his hat back, "I'm not one to discourage a man's efforts, but I can't help but wonder if you've thought this through. A barn around a Quonset hut? It's a lot of work for something that might not even give you the results you're hoping for." Thomas set down his hammer, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked Hank in the eye. "I've thought about it plenty, and I'm willing to see it through. It's the only way I'll know if it works." Hank gave a short nod. "Well, it's your time, Thomas, but don't say I didn't warn you if it all falls apart." The doubt in Hank's voice stung, but Thomas just nodded. He wasn't in this for approval. He wasn't in this to win anyone over. He was in this because he believed it could work. And if it didn't, then he would have learned something, and that was better than never trying at all. As the days passed and winter deepened, the barn continued to rise, despite the skepticism and the growing doubts of his neighbors. Thomas didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. The project wasn't just about building a better shelter. It was about proving that thinking outside the box could lead to something greater. The ridicule only fueled his determination. The cold had arrived with a vengeance, as it always did in this part of the world. The first snowstorm of the season was nothing less than a blizzard, howling through the town like a living creature, rattling windows and clawing at doors. As Thomas stood in the barn, now fully enclosed, he could feel the temperature drop outside, the wind biting at the walls. He pulled his coat tighter around himself, but it wasn't just the cold he felt. It was something else, something he hadn't anticipated. He had spent weeks perfecting the structure, but there was still doubt in his mind. He had built the barn to insulate the Quonset hut, but he didn't know if it would work. The space between the two structures was meant to trap a cushion of air, allowing the warmth from inside the hut to stay in. But could it really make a difference? The next few days would test that theory. Thomas had always been a man of observation. And that evening, after finishing his work for the day, he sat by the fire inside the Quonset hut. He had built a small stove to heat the space, but in previous winters it hadn't been enough. The room would grow chilly by nightfall, the cold creeping in around the edges, but tonight was different. The fire crackled merrily, and Thomas felt something he hadn't in years: warmth. Real warmth that lingered even after the flames had died down. The temperature inside the hut had remained steady, a full 44 degrees, an unusual feat for this time of year. In fact, it was almost too warm for the weather outside, where the temperature had dropped well below freezing. He couldn't believe it. The space between the barn and the Quonset hut, the air pocket, was working. The cold was still fierce outside, but inside it felt almost like spring. Thomas stood, wiping his brow in disbelief. He checked the thermometer again. The numbers didn't lie. For the first time since he had started the project, Thomas felt a surge of excitement. The idea, his idea, was working. The space he had created around the hut wasn't just keeping the cold out, it was trapping heat and holding it in. The insulation he had dreamed of was now a reality, and it wasn't just keeping him comfortable, it was proving that he had found a solution to one of the most persistent problems of frontier life, surviving the brutal winters. He could already hear the murmurs from the neighbors, even though they were miles away. He didn't need to hear them to know what they would say now. The barn wasn't a joke anymore, it was a breakthrough. He smiled to himself, letting the warmth of the hut seep into his bones. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving. The long, lonely winters that once seemed so endless now felt like a challenge he had just overcome, and there was more to come, much more. As the days wore on, Thomas continued to experiment, fine-tuning the design of his barn and hut setup. The weather outside remained relentlessly cold, but inside the steady 44 degrees persisted. It wasn't just the warmth that amazed him, it was the consistency. Even when the winds howled and snow drifted up against the barn's walls, the hut stayed stable. Thomas had always been a man who thought in terms of practicality. The barn wasn't just a place to store things, it had to serve a purpose. He began to wonder if there was more to this invention than just keeping warm. Could it be used for something else? Could it be a model for others, a way to help the entire town survive the harsh winters? He started thinking about the structure in a new way, looking at the airflow and insulation with the mind of an engineer. The air pocket between the barn and the Quonset hut wasn't just a simple barrier, it was a dynamic system. It had its own rhythm, its own way of regulating heat. The cold air outside was heavy and dense, but the space trapped between the two structures was lighter, and it allowed air to circulate. One morning, while checking the measurements of the temperature again, Thomas realized that he had created something far beyond his initial expectations. The air pocket wasn't just preventing the cold from entering, it was actively helping to regulate the temperature inside. The barn's walls, which had seemed so simple at first, were actually working in concert with the Quonset hut to create a climate-controlled environment. The idea that the temperature could remain stable day and night was revolutionary. It wasn't just about keeping warm, it was about creating an environment that was naturally regulated, almost like an artificial ecosystem. The air pocket was more than just insulation. It was a new way of thinking about space and temperature. The simplicity of the structure was its genius. Thomas knew that he couldn't keep this discovery to himself. As much as the townspeople had doubted him before, he couldn't deny the truth now. This barn, this structure he had built, was proof that sometimes the simplest ideas could solve the biggest problems. He made a decision. He would invite the neighbors over. They had watched him for months, laughed at his work, but now it was time to show them the results. It wasn't about proving them wrong, but about showing them that thinking differently had its rewards. Thomas cleaned up the space, preparing for the arrival of his neighbors. When they saw the barn for what it truly was, not just a joke but a solution, maybe, just maybe, they would see the value in what he had created. The time for mockery was over. It was time for discovery. He could already hear the sounds of his neighbors approaching. This time, he wasn't just another fool. This time, he was a man with something real to show. With the temperature inside the Quonset hut holding steady at 44 degrees, Thomas began to think beyond just survival. His original goal had been simple, to keep warm during the brutal winters. But now that the system was working, he saw the potential for something greater. This wasn't just an insulation solution, it was a sustainable way to live in one of the harshest climates on Earth. He spent hours studying the space between the barn and the Quonset hut, examining the flow of air and the way the temperature remained so stable. The more he observed, the more he realized that this air pocket was not merely a byproduct of the barn's design, it was the key to the entire system. The cold air trapped inside the gap acted as a natural buffer against the elements, while the warmth from inside the hut filtered into the space and was preserved. The idea of creating a barrier around the hut wasn't new, but Thomas had found a way to make it work, without relying on thick layers of insulation that would be difficult to maintain. The air pocket was a passive system, one that didn't require constant attention or heavy materials to function. It was, in a way, nature's own form of insulation. The barn created a microclimate, a shield that kept the cold at bay while keeping the warmth in. Thomas also realized that this system could have other applications. In the future, this method of insulation could be used in other types of buildings, even homes. The simplicity of it, combined with its effectiveness, made it an ideal solution for anyone living in cold climates. It didn't require high-tech materials or complicated systems. It relied on basic principles of airflow and thermal regulation. As he worked, Thomas began to refine the barn's design further. He started adding more layers of natural materials inside the barn to increase the insulation. Straw, hay, and even thick blankets of moss were added along the walls. These materials weren't just for insulation. They helped to regulate the humidity in the air, keeping the environment inside the hut both warm and dry. It was a simple but ingenious way of using natural materials to create a self-sustaining system. Each day, as he worked on perfecting the setup, Thomas thought about how to make the barn more efficient. He considered adding small vents to control the airflow between the hut and the barn. By carefully adjusting the openings, he could direct the flow of warm air, ensuring that it was distributed evenly across the hut. The idea was simple, but in Thomas's mind, it was brilliant. It wasn't just about keeping the cold out. It was about creating a balance, a perfect harmony between the environment outside and the warmth within. The more Thomas refined the system, the more he realized that he had stumbled upon something far bigger than he had originally imagined. What started as a simple, almost desperate attempt to survive the cold had turned into an innovative approach to insulation. He wasn't just building a barn anymore, he was creating the future of rural living. The first few weeks after the barn was completed had been quiet. Thomas worked on his own, making small adjustments to the design, testing new materials, and ensuring the barn's insulation remained effective. But he knew the day would come when the neighbors would want to see it for themselves. They had watched him from a distance, scoffing at his idea and ridiculing him for wasting time on what they thought was a fruitless project. Now things were different. The barn wasn't just a pile of wood and metal anymore, it was a proven success. One morning, as Thomas was inspecting the barn's framework, he saw the first group of neighbors making their way across the field. At first they walked slowly, cautiously, as if they weren't sure whether to approach or turn back. There was no laughter now, just curiosity. The word had spread quickly through the town. Something was different about Thomas's barn. It wasn't just a barn, it was working. As the group approached, Thomas stood up from his work and wiped his hands on his pants. He'd been waiting for this moment, but he wasn't sure what to expect. Would they ask questions? Would they admit that they had been wrong to doubt him? Or would they continue to stand by their original opinions? Sam Tilden, the blacksmith, was the first to speak. He was a large man with a booming voice, and he had been one of Thomas's most vocal critics. But now his tone was different, softer, more thoughtful. "Thomas," Sam said, "I'll be honest. I thought you were crazy for building this thing. But damn it, it looks like you might have figured something out." Thomas nodded, trying not to smile too broadly. "It's working," he said simply. "It's keeping the hut warm. 44 degrees, steady, even in this storm." The others nodded, clearly impressed. They had seen the barn from a distance, but hadn't thought to check it out for themselves. Now, standing just outside its walls, they could feel the difference. The air was still cold, but it was clear that inside, something had changed. "This air pocket," Sam continued, rubbing his chin thoughtfully, "it's not just trapping heat. It's like it's creating its own environment in there. You've done something, Thomas. something I didn't think was possible. One of the other men, a farmer named Hank, took a step closer to the barn, running his hand along the rough wooden beams. "I'll admit, I didn't think it would work," he said, glancing at Thomas. "But if it's as warm inside as you say, then you've got something here. Hell, I'd like to try it myself." Thomas felt a quiet satisfaction as he watched his neighbors slowly realize the value of his work. This wasn't about proving them wrong, it was about showing them that sometimes the most unconventional ideas were the ones that worked the best. They had laughed at him, but now they were seeing the truth in his work. "I'd be happy to show you how it works," Thomas said, his voice steady. "It's not just about building a barn, it's about understanding how air moves and how materials interact. I've spent a lot of time figuring it out." The group nodded in agreement, and for the first time Thomas felt a sense of camaraderie with his neighbors. They were no longer laughing at him. They were curious, eager to learn, and that was exactly what he had hoped for. The barn wasn't just a solution for him anymore. It was a solution for the entire community. The first test came with a storm that swept through the valley like a wild animal, furiously lashing against the land. The wind howled louder than any of them had expected, rattling the trees and sending snow drifting in sheets. As the storm intensified, Thomas stood in his cabin, watching through the small window. The snow piled higher and higher, and the air grew sharper with every passing minute. It felt as though the world outside was slowly being swallowed by the storm. Inside the Quonset hut, however, everything felt different. The air was calm, the temperature steady at a comfortable 44 degrees, just as it had been the last few weeks. The storm outside raged on, but the barn and the air pocket had kept the cold at bay, and the temperature inside the hut never wavered. The stability was remarkable. It wasn't just the fact that the hut remained warm, it was the way the warmth stayed consistent, even as the winds outside threatened to tear everything apart. For the first time, Thomas felt that all of his hard work, all the doubts and ridicule, had led to something real. The barn wasn't just an insulation barrier anymore, it was a proof of concept. It was a way to survive and thrive in the harshest conditions. As the wind grew louder outside, Thomas ventured out into the storm, carefully stepping over the snowdrifts to inspect the barn. The walls creaked under the strain of the wind, but everything remained intact. He checked the air pocket between the Quonset hut and the barn. The air seemed to be trapped in a perfect balance, keeping the space insulated and protected. He spent a few minutes walking around the perimeter, taking in the sight of his creation, fully functional and sturdy, standing firm against nature's fury. Afterward, he returned inside to the warmth of the hut, the fire crackling in the stove. He leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The storm was a reminder of the unpredictable force of nature, but it was also a reminder that sometimes the simplest solutions could be the most effective. The barn he had built was now a refuge, a safe haven in the midst of chaos. And it wasn't just a refuge for him. The solution was there for the taking, and his neighbors were starting to realize it. The next day, after the storm had passed, the word spread quickly through the town. People began to show up at his door one by one to see for themselves. They had heard the stories, but now they needed to see it with their own eyes. The neighbors who had once laughed at Thomas's idea were now standing outside, looking at the barn with new eyes. Thomas welcomed them in, inviting them to step inside the Quonset hut. As they entered, they were greeted by warmth, a stark contrast to the icy winds still blowing outside. "I'll be damned," Sam Tilden said, stepping back with a wide grin on his face. "It's warmer than my own house. This thing really works." And with that, Thomas felt the weight of years of doubt lift off his shoulders. The ridicule had been hard, but now he had something more valuable than their approval. He had proven his idea. The validation wasn't just in the success of the project itself, but in the shift in perception. They hadn't just accepted it, they were eager to learn from him. As word spread about Thomas's barn and the extraordinary air pocket that had kept his Quonset hut warm through one of the worst storms the town had seen, something unexpected began to happen. The skepticism that had once filled the town's conversations slowly began to give way to curiosity. It wasn't just Thomas who had seen the benefits of this new method of insulation. Now everyone wanted to know how it worked. Neighbors who had once dismissed his idea as foolish were now eager to come by and learn. Some came to ask for advice on how to build their own barns, while others wanted to understand the science behind the air pocket that had kept the hut so warm. The town, once filled with ridicule, was beginning to embrace something new, something innovative. Hank, the farmer who had once joked that Thomas was wasting his time, was the first to return with a request. He stood in the doorway of the Quonset hut, rubbing his hands together against the cold. "Thomas," he said, "I've been thinking about what you did here. I want to try building one of these barns around my own place. My family and I struggle with the cold every winter, and I've been trying everything I can think of to keep warm." Thomas nodded, understanding the hesitation. He'd been where Hank was, unsure whether his idea would work or whether it was worth the time and effort. But now, with the cold still howling outside and the warmth inside the hut as proof, it was hard to deny the potential. "It's not just the barn," Thomas said. "It's about understanding the space between the two structures. The air pocket is the key. It's like creating a natural barrier that keeps the cold from seeping in." Hank listened closely as Thomas explained the details of the design. He described how the air pocket trapped warmth and how the materials Thomas had chosen helped create a controlled environment inside. Hank, who had always relied on traditional methods of insulation, seemed fascinated by the idea. "I'll need to gather some supplies," Hank said thoughtfully, "but I think this could work for us." As Hank left, promising to return with materials, Thomas felt a quiet sense of pride. He hadn't just proven his idea to the town, he had created a ripple effect, a change in the way people thought about survival in the cold. The solution he had developed wasn't just a personal victory, it was a gift for everyone in the town, and it wasn't just about surviving the winter anymore, it was about thriving even in the harshest conditions. Over the following weeks, more neighbors came to Thomas for advice. Each one had their own version of the same problem: how to stay warm in a home that was unprepared for the extreme temperatures. Thomas welcomed them all, offering his knowledge freely. The town was changing, slowly but surely. What had once been a place where the old ways held fast had begun to embrace innovation. And it all started with one man, one barn, and a belief that sometimes the simplest ideas could make the biggest difference. The early days of spring were a time of change, not just for the land, but for the people of the valley. The thaw brought new life to the snow-covered fields, and with it, a renewed sense of energy in the town. What had started as a solitary effort by Thomas had now become a shared goal. His once quirky idea had taken root, and people were adapting it to their own lives. Hank, the farmer who had been one of Thomas's most vocal skeptics, was the first to fully embrace the new insulation method. His barn was now complete, a massive structure surrounding his own Quonset hut. The winter had been kinder to his family, and they were more comfortable than they had ever been before. Word quickly spread that Hank's farm was now warmer, more efficient, and even more functional than before. As other neighbors saw the success of Hank's project, they followed suit. Thomas watched the transformation quietly, as his own barn continued to perform well through the early spring. It wasn't just the success of his own design that filled him with pride, it was the way the community had come together. No longer were people laughing at his ideas. They were asking for his help, seeking his advice, and even making their own modifications to improve the concept. One afternoon, as Thomas was walking into town, he passed a few of the younger farmers working on their own versions of the barn. They waved to him, nodding in appreciation. "Hey, Thomas," one of them called. "We tried your air pocket trick. It's working like a charm. You were right about how it holds the warmth." "Glad to hear it," Thomas replied with a smile, though his mind was already racing with the possibilities of how to further refine the design. There was always more to be done, more ideas to explore. The town had changed in ways Thomas couldn't have predicted. It was no longer a place where everyone adhered to tradition simply for the sake of it. The valley was evolving, and innovation was no longer a dirty word. People were excited about the future, about finding better ways to live, to keep warm, to endure the relentless winters. One evening, Thomas sat outside his hut, the sun dipping low behind the mountains, casting a golden glow across the landscape. He looked at the rows of new barns now dotting the valley, each one a testament to the community's resilience. He knew the work wasn't finished. There were still adjustments to be made, still more people to convince. But there was something profoundly satisfying in seeing how far they had come. He had gone from being the town's eccentric outcast to being a quiet leader, the man who had brought a new way of thinking to a community set in its ways. It wasn't just about surviving the winter anymore. It was about building something that could last, something that could stand up to the challenges the land threw at them year after year. As the spring thaw turned into summer, Thomas found himself facing new challenges, not from the weather, but from the designs of others who had adopted his method. As his neighbors began to construct their own barns and adapt the system to their homes, they started encountering issues that Thomas had not anticipated. These weren't problems of insulation or warmth. They were practical challenges that came with living with the system day after day. The first problem arose when several people complained that the space between the Quonset hut and the barn was too tight. While the air pocket had worked to trap warmth, it had also led to an increase in humidity. This wasn't an issue for Thomas, who had kept a close eye on moisture levels inside his barn, but it was a new problem for those who had not considered the long-term effects. One afternoon, a neighbor named Gerald, a sheep farmer, came by to talk to Thomas. His barn had been up for several months now, but the humidity in the air pocket was causing the wooden beams to swell and warp. The timber wasn't as dry as it should have been, and the combination of moisture and trapped heat had made some of the wood in his barn more vulnerable to decay. "I'm getting some warping on the inside," Gerald explained, as he stood on the porch of Thomas's hut. "It's not too bad yet, but I'm worried it might get worse over time. The air pocket's great for keeping the heat in, but it's not drying out as quickly as I thought it would." Thomas listened carefully, thinking through the issue. This wasn't a problem he'd run into before, but he had a few ideas on how to fix it. He'd always been able to think his way through problems, and this was no different. "I think the issue is the ventilation," Thomas said thoughtfully. "The air between the hut and the barn needs to circulate more. It's not just about trapping the heat, you need to let the moisture escape. I've been experimenting with a small vent at the top of the barn that I think might help." Gerald looked relieved. "I was thinking I might have to start over, but that sounds doable." Together, the two men spent the next few hours, adjusting Gerald's barn, adding a few small vents near the top of the structure to allow for better airflow. It wasn't a huge change, but it made a noticeable difference. As they worked, more neighbors stopped by, asking about the adjustments. Thomas had inadvertently become a teacher, a guide for others trying to navigate the complexities of the design. This was just the first of many challenges to come. As more people adopted the system, there were bound to be other issues. Small things that Thomas hadn't thought of, things that only experience could uncover. But he didn't mind. Every challenge was an opportunity to refine the design further, to improve it, to make it even better. For the first time, Thomas understood that innovation wasn't a one-time thing. It was a process, a never-ending journey of improvement. And as the community embraced that journey, it brought them closer together. No longer just a man with a crazy idea, Thomas had become a vital part of something much bigger than himself. As the weeks turned into months, The once quiet and remote valley was now alive with new energy. What had started as one man's idea, an eccentric solution to the bitter cold of winter, had spread throughout the community. The ripple effect of Thomas's invention was undeniable. Neighbors who had initially scoffed at his barn now sought to replicate it, each with their own unique twists and improvements. What had seemed like a ridiculous project was now a symbol of innovation and practicality. By summer, barns similar to Thomas's were cropping up all over the valley. Farmers and families were making the necessary adjustments to their homes, learning from the trials and successes of the early adopters. The design had not only provided warmth and insulation during the winter, but it was also proving to be a model for efficient living in an unforgiving climate. Thomas had managed to transform his personal struggle for warmth into a collective solution that was changing the way people lived. One day, as Thomas made his way to town to gather supplies, he found a few people waiting for him at the general store. They had gathered to discuss the barn construction and were eager to hear Thomas's advice on improving the design. "Thomas," Hank called out as he approached, holding a roll of blueprints, "I've been working on my barn and I think I've got it figured out, but I want to hear your thoughts." Thomas raised an eyebrow, surprised by Hank's earnestness. Just a year ago, Hank had been one of the most vocal skeptics, dismissing the idea as a waste of time. Now, he was actively seeking Thomas's input. "I've added a ventilation system," Hank continued, "so the moisture doesn't build up in the air pocket like we saw last spring. I think it'll keep the wood from warping." Thomas nodded, impressed by Hank's initiative. "It sounds like you're on the right track. Ventilation is key. As long as the air circulates properly, the barn will stay dry and stable. Keep an eye on it, and you should be good." Hank grinned. "Thanks, Thomas. You've really changed the way we think around here." It wasn't just Hank. More and more people had come to Thomas, eager to improve their own homes. Some asked for blueprints, others for advice on materials, but the most rewarding part for Thomas was seeing the shift in mindset. No longer were his ideas met with ridicule. The community was now taking ownership of the innovation. People were no longer building barns just because Thomas had done it. They were building them because they saw the practical benefits and wanted to improve their own lives. As Thomas walked home that afternoon, he felt a quiet sense of pride. The air pocket, once a mere experiment, had grown into something bigger than he had ever imagined. It was a solution that had worked not only for him, but for an entire community. He had sparked a change, and the ripple effect had transformed the valley in ways that were impossible to foresee. The impact of his barn was now undeniable. It was no longer about proving something to others. It was about showing what could be accomplished when people dared to think differently. And in the process, the town had become stronger, more connected, and more innovative. As the months passed and the town continued to embrace the innovation that Thomas had brought to them, he found himself reflecting more and more on the journey that had led him here. The barn that had once seemed like a desperate attempt to keep warm had become a symbol of progress, a testament to the power of perseverance and ingenuity. Thomas sat on the porch of his Quonset hut one evening, watching the sun set over the valley. The air was warm, and the sounds of laughter and conversation floated up from the nearby farms. Neighbors were working together to build the new barns, exchanging tips and sharing ideas. The valley that had once been a place of isolation now felt like a community, united by a shared goal of making life a little bit easier. He thought about the early days when he had first begun constructing the barn. At the time it had seemed like a crazy idea, something that no one would understand. But as he had worked slowly, methodically, it had come together. The more he built, the more he realized that the solution wasn't just about keeping warm. It was about finding a better way to live in the cold, harsh environment they all shared. It had been a long, lonely road, especially when the town had ridiculed him. The whispers, the laughter, it had all stung. but it had only fueled his determination. He had never once doubted the value of his idea. He had trusted his instincts, even when everyone else seemed certain he was wasting his time. Now, as he looked at the growing number of barns in the valley, he knew that his persistence had paid off. What surprised him most, however, was how the community had come together in the process. It hadn't just been about him anymore, it had become a collective effort. People were sharing their own ideas, improving on his design and making it their own. The barn had turned into something more than just a practical solution. It had become a way for the town to connect, to innovate, and to grow together. As the seasons changed and life in the valley shifted into a new rhythm, Thomas realized that the journey had been about more than just surviving the cold. It had been about finding a way to thrive, not just alone, but with others. The challenges of the past year, the ridicule, the hard work, the uncertainty, had all led to something greater. He had set out to make life easier for himself, but in doing so, he had made life easier for everyone around him. The barn, the air pocket, the warmth that it provided. It wasn't just about comfort. It was about resilience, about adapting to the world around you and finding a way to live with it, not against it. And in the end, that was what truly mattered. As Thomas stood up from the porch and walked into his hut, he knew that the legacy of his barn would endure long after he was gone. It wasn't just about building something practical. It was about building a better future for everyone. It was the middle of summer when the first group of outsiders came through the valley. They weren't locals, but engineers from a nearby city, sent by a regional organization that helped communities in cold climates find more efficient ways to build. Thomas had never expected his little barn to attract such attention, but now, as he stood in his yard, watching the men approach, he couldn't deny that he was curious. Hank had heard about the group first. "They've heard about your barn, Thomas," Hank told him, standing on the porch with a raised eyebrow. "I didn't believe it myself, but it seems they want to see it for real." The men were polite, but there was a certain air of skepticism about them. They weren't sure what they'd find, but they knew that if Thomas's barn was as effective as they'd heard, it could change the way people thought about rural housing in cold climates. "I'm not sure what you're expecting," Thomas said, wiping his hands on his pants as he stood before the men. "It's just a barn built around a Quonset hut. I didn't mean to make a big fuss about it." But as the engineers walked around the barn, inspecting the structure, the atmosphere shifted. They measured the thickness of the walls, the air pocket between the barn and the Quonset hut, and the way the heat seemed to be retained inside the space. "This is remarkable," one of the engineers said, his voice laced with disbelief. "We've never seen anything like this. It's incredibly efficient, not just for insulation, but for energy conservation. You've essentially created a natural heating system." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "It's just basic principles of air circulation," he explained. "I didn't do anything fancy, just worked with the environment." The engineers were impressed, and they spent hours documenting the design, taking notes, and asking Thomas about the specifics of how the system worked. They had seen the potential in his design, and it wasn't long before they asked for permission to share it with other communities. "This could be the start of something big," one engineer said, shaking Thomas's hand. "We'll get the word out. You might want to think about sharing your techniques with others, maybe even helping develop a more widespread method." Thomas felt a strange sense of pride as he watched them leave. He had never set out to change the world, but here he was, standing on the edge of something much larger than himself. People were now looking to him for solutions, for advice, and he realized just how far his idea had come. But even as recognition grew, Thomas remained humble. He wasn't interested in fame or fortune. He only wanted to help his community, and if his barn could help other towns, so much the better. As the engineers left, Thomas stood there for a long time, looking at the barn. It wasn't about the barn anymore. It was about what it represented. It was a symbol of progress, of the power of simple solutions, and of the way innovation could come from the most unexpected places. The years rolled by quickly, and the valley continued to thrive. The barns were now a common sight, dotted across the landscape, each one a reminder of the change that had come to this small, rural community. Thomas had never intended for his project to become a movement, but as time passed, he began to realize that what he had started was something much bigger than he had anticipated. The engineers who had visited years earlier had taken Thomas's design to other parts of the region, and soon his concept of the insulated barn and air pocket system had become widely known. Communities across the Northern Territories were adopting similar designs, each one modifying the structure to fit their own needs. But at the heart of it all was the basic idea Thomas had stumbled upon, using the environment itself to create a more efficient and livable space. As the years went on, the community continued to flourish. What had once been a town known for its isolation and tradition had now become a beacon of innovation. People came from all over to learn from Thomas's example, and he spent his time helping them build their own barns, offering advice on how to perfect the design. He was always eager to share what he had learned, but never in a boastful way. His work spoke for itself. In his quiet moments, Thomas reflected on how far he had come. He thought back to the days when people had laughed at him, when they had mocked his idea as impossible. Now, as he walked through the town, he saw the barns standing proudly in every direction. People were warmer, safer, and more comfortable than ever before. It was a testament to what could be achieved when someone refused to accept the status quo, when they dared to think differently. One afternoon, as Thomas sat on the porch of his Quonset hut, he received a letter from one of the engineers who had visited him all those years ago. The letter was filled with gratitude, but more importantly, it spoke of the wider impact Thomas's barn had had. It had saved lives, improved homes, and made communities stronger. The design was now being used in larger cities, even in areas where the winters weren't as harsh because of its efficiency. Thomas smiled as he read the letter, his fingers tracing the edges of the paper. His work had become part of something larger than himself, a movement that had touched lives, shaped communities, and even changed the way people thought about shelter. As the sun set over the valley, Thomas felt at peace. He had started with nothing but an idea, a small thought born out of necessity, and now it had blossomed into something much bigger. The barn had become a symbol of resilience, of ingenuity, and of the power of simple solutions. And though he had never sought fame, Thomas knew that his legacy would live on in the barns that stood strong against the cold, the air pockets that kept families warm, and the communities that had come together to embrace a new way of living. As the seasons turned and the years slipped away, Thomas continued to live quietly in the valley, content with the knowledge that his small innovation had changed so many lives. The once laughing neighbors, now his friends and collaborators, had built their own versions of his barn, and the entire community had embraced his simple yet brilliant design. Thomas's Quonset hut was still standing, the barn still wrapped around it, and the air pocket continued to work its magic every winter. Over the years, Thomas had grown older, his hair had grayed, and his back, once strong from years of hard labor, had begun to ache. Yet, in the quiet of his cabin, with the fire crackling in the stove and the wind howling outside, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. His work had helped his neighbors survive the harsh winters, but it had also helped them thrive. The valley had become a place of warmth, not just in temperature, but in spirit. People now worked together more than ever before, each person contributing to the shared goal of improving their lives. As the valley became more connected, Thomas watched from the sidelines, proud of the change he had sparked. He no longer felt like the outsider, the oddball with the strange idea. He was part of something bigger, a community that had grown through collaboration, innovation, and the willingness to embrace new ways of thinking. Despite the progress, Thomas remained humble, always content with the life he had built for himself and for others. He continued to help his neighbors when they needed it, offering advice and guidance, but he was no longer the center of attention. His ideas had already taken root, and now they were flourishing on their own. As the years wore on, he found that his role in the community had shifted. He no longer had to prove anything. The barns spoke for themselves. The success of his idea had surpassed anything he had ever dreamed of. Thomas knew that, in a way, his legacy would live on in the barns that dotted the valley, in the warmth they provided, and in the lives they had saved. But even as he sat on his porch one quiet evening, gazing out at the valley that had become home, he couldn't shake the feeling that his work wasn't finished. There was still more to learn, more to discover. The world was a big place, and who knew what other ideas could be born from something as simple as a barn around a Quonset hut? As Thomas grew older, his days became quieter, filled with small routines and long reflective moments. The barn that had once been the source of so much doubt and ridicule was now a symbol of innovation and change. People came from near and far to see it, to learn from Thomas's work. But despite the recognition, the praise, and the admiration, Thomas remained the same. He never sought out fame or wealth. All he had ever wanted was to help, to find a way to make life a little bit easier for himself and for those around him. One afternoon, Thomas was sitting on the porch of his Quonset hut, a slight breeze brushing against his weathered skin. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the valley. The sound of children playing in the distance and the hum of activity from the farms filled the air. It was a peaceful day, the kind of day Thomas had always loved. But this time, as he watched the world around him, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything that had come to pass. He had started with a simple idea, a way to stay warm in the coldest winters. But that idea had grown into something far bigger than himself. The barns had not only changed the way people built their homes, they had changed the way people thought. They had become a symbol of resilience, of adapting to the environment, and of the power of small, simple solutions. Thomas's legacy was not just in the design of the barn, but in the way it had brought people together. It had shown them that even in the harshest conditions, there was always a way to find warmth, both physically and emotionally. It had taught them that sometimes the most groundbreaking ideas came from the simplest of places, a man with a vision and a willingness to experiment. As the evening wore on, Thomas felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had lived a life true to his values, one of hard work, humility, and perseverance. He had faced ridicule, doubt, and uncertainty, but he had never let it deter him. In the end, it wasn't about proving anyone wrong, it was about finding a solution to a problem that mattered to him, and in doing so, solving a problem for so many others. The next morning, as Thomas awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside, he felt a quiet satisfaction. He had done what he set out to do, and more. He had helped his community, and he had left a legacy that would endure long after he was gone. Thomas Granger had built more than a barn around a Quonset hut. He had built a future for his community, a future that was warmer, more connected, and full of possibility. And as he stepped outside to greet the new day, he knew that his work was done. The rest, as they say, would take care of itself.